So, our video today is about Mendelian genetics, which is the term we use for basic or the underlying principles of genetics. So, who was Mendel? Gregor Mendel was an Augustinian monk. That's a certain type of Catholic monk who did a series of experiments using pea plants in order to try and figure out how traits are passed from parents to offspring. The important thing to understand here is that Gregor Mendel did his experiments and came to his conclusions with no understanding of DNA or chromosomes or meiosis. He didn't know about any of that. He proved his rules for inheritance based on mathematical principles. So he used math to work out the rules of inheritance. He's the one who gives us terms like dominant and recessive traits. So a dominant trait is one that will be expressed when present. Recessive requires 2 copies of that trait to be expressed. And some examples of some classic Mendelian traits in humans would be things like hitchhiker's thumb, eye dominance, tongue rolling, earlobe attachment. And some of these we are starting to uncover have more genes that interact with them, and there's some other things that can affect these things. But some basic traits are what we are looking at. So Mendel worked on some very specific types of traits. He worked with color of the flowers of these pea plants. And pea plants come in 2 color varieties. They come in purple and they come in white. Purple is the dominant coloration and white is the recessive coloration. And so what he would do is he would take the plants that he wanted to breed and he would remove the male parts, the stamens, and that's what they're showing you in this picture, that he would just cut them with a pair of scissors. He would remove those parts. And with the pistil, which is the female part of the flower, he would plant the pollen he wanted. So he would take the pollen that he desired from a different pea plant and put it on the female part or the pistil of the plant he wanted to fertilize. And this is how he controlled reproduction. So he would take his parent generation of pea plants and he crossed them, and that's what created the F1 generation. F1 kind of stands for offspring 1, so like the first offspring generation. And so he prevented these plants from self-fertilizing, and he controlled fertilization. And when he did that, he started to notice that he would have traits skip generations. He would mate white and purple pea plants. None of their offspring would be white. And then he would allow those flowers to self-fertilize so that he could see what their offspring would be, and he would get white flowers back. So after doing this for many different trials, some of his evidence suggests that he did this hundreds of times over a span of years. He started to notice some patterns, and that led him to his conclusions. Mendel had 3 important conclusions. Traits were inherited as discrete units. Now, I am using the text of his conclusions here. We know that discrete units are actually chromosomes. We already know what those are called. Those are called chromosomes. But he didn't know what a chromosome was. So he had to kind of use these terms that don't make a lot of sense. They're not specific. They're very vague because he understood what was happening, but he didn't have a term to describe it. So he just used the term discrete units. We know that as chromosomes now. We, as organisms, inherit 2 copies of each chromosome, one from each parent, which makes sense. We have talked about how meiosis happens. We've talked about gamete formation. We've talked about fertilization. So we know where those copies of each chromosome are coming from. And then when we ourselves make gametes, that we're going to separate those copies into separate gametes. And that's what meiosis is all about, separating those chromosomes into different gametes to be passed on to our next generation of offspring. Just an important note here, those last 2 conclusions are called the law of segregation. So, the rest of this video is going to be kind of some vocab that we're going to use. Gene is a segment of DNA. A gene can be found on a chromosome. Like my picture here has a gene highlighted in yellow, and on this chromosome it's highlighted in blue. Alleles are different varieties. So this is a set of chromosomes for flower color in peas. And so you have the purple allele and you have the white allele. Those are what we call the different varieties of a gene. Other examples of these would be hair color, and then there are different varieties, brown, red, blonde, all of those. Then you have genotype, which is the allele combination. So here, this person, or this flower, I should say, has the purple allele and the white allele. So their allele combination has both the dominant and recessive allele. The phenotype is the physical expression of the trait. So it's what we actually see in the flower. So even though we have both alleles, the flower is going to be purple because purple is the dominant color for flower color in peas. So genotype, we generally write those as letters. We can write the genotype capital A, which indicates that they have both dominant alleles. And then we have phenotype, which in this case would be something like freckles. So dominant alleles, like I said before, only require 1 copy of that allele to be expressed. So if you have the dominant allele, that's what's going to be expressed. The recessive allele, on the other hand, requires 2 copies in order to be expressed. And then finally, some terms for the different genotypes we see in organisms. We have heterozygous, where we have 1 dominant allele, 1 recessive. We have homozygous recessive, where we have 2 recessive alleles. And we have homozygous dominant, where we have 2 dominant alleles. This is all we're going to cover in this video. Getting a good handle on these vocab terms is going to be really important moving forward as we utilize this information in class for our Punnett squares and our pedigrees. So if you have any issues understanding these terms, make sure to kind of go back and watch this video again to really get a good handle on these vocab.